Okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're live now, but just to make sure we are any messages on the comments, like if anyone could just comment, you hear me, you see me, this is connected, that would be really helpful. Just any confirmation works. Okay. I see people saying, how can you join the broadcast? I'm going with the assumption that this works. I'm going to take 2-3 minutes just to make sure we have everybody. It's taking a minute for people to join. Okay, can anyone just comment yes, we can hear you fine? Just making sure that's fine. Okay, that perfect. Perfect. Okay. So just taking 2-3 more minutes to get enough people to join in. Um, main idea here is that we want the session to be more interactive. I basically like for people to have questions, be liberal with whatever questions you have, in terms of research, AI, ML, whatever it is, like career paths, etc., whatever you like to talk about. The goal here is I'll start briefly with my journey that should hopefully add some context in terms of how you could start, etc. But over time, we would like that, we can get your questions in. So take this as an opportunity to ask whatever personalized kind of directed questions you get. I know we didn't have enough time to kind of share more about this on LinkedIn, but hopefully I get a lot of messages every day asking questions about how they can start in research, etc. So hopefully, if you have any questions, feel free to send them out. We'll take them up, and yeah, let's try to keep this as interactive as possible. That's going to uh, allow us to be more productive with this. So it'll just take 2-3 more minutes for people to come in, and at the same time, if you have questions, start putting them in already. But we'll spend the first 10-15 minutes going over the journey, and then we'll go over the questions that we get with people. Also, thanks for taking the time out on a Sunday night, pretty much, if you're in India. And if you're interested in terms of learning more about research in general, initiatives we're doing at scale or initiatives I'm doing on my own, all of those kind of things, I talk about a lot of these things on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. So feel free to start reading the posts there, be more engaged, so that you can access more of these things over time as well. And yeah, I see already we have a couple of questions coming in, so we'll start looking at these questions as soon as we are done with the journey aspect of it. But just to get a heads up till then, how many of you here, yeah, I see a lot of people talking about their background already. How many of you people here are interested in an industry AI ML kind of role as opposed to a master's or a PhD? Just curious to understand that. What are your career aspirations? Feel free to put those in the comments. I'm reading each one of those. So it'd be nice to know what is it that you're trying to achieve in terms of career aspirations and goals. See, a BTech CS graduate who's in the marketing domain and wants to shift. See, mechanical engineering. So those saying me, just also let me know what part of it interests you. Like, are you more interested in higher education? Are you more interested in industry oriented MLAI? We could go with we could discuss more of those directions specifically. Yeah, I think also to the point that some of the people here are talking about, the goal of the session is to be very, I would say, beginner friendly. You're not expected to have any kind of prerequisites, etc. This is more of a conversation oriented thing as opposed to kind of going, and going into some deep technicals or whatever. So, see a lot of people interested in more industry oriented things. A few people also interested in PhDs, higher education, and those kind of things. So I think I'll try to touch on both of the angles, but keep in mind that I'm someone who hasn't done a master's or a PhD yet. So although I know enough people who have done it, I might not be the best person to give that advice. However, I'll still, give you my thoughts on that anyway. Industry AI, definitely, I think there's more that I can contribute in that direction. So I'll talk about that. One, I'm just going to quickly see if there's any way of saving these questions. Just a minute about that. Okay, so I think we have enough questions. We hopefully have. Uh, 1 second. It's going to start in a minute. Checking on one or two small details here. But I can see a few questions around what pays more in terms of data science and full stack. I think depends on a lot of factors, but I would say this, that an interesting finding I've had is that more similar roles, or like similar job, not similar job family, similar levels across job families, like data science versus SDE. Data science here being more MLAI oriented, not analyst like work, but more ML scientist kind of roles tend to pay more usually. Okay, so that being said, I think we'll give it a start, and we'll start taking your questions. I think they're already enough, so we'll start taking them shortly. But I'll briefly start with what my career journey was in terms of getting into research, and hopefully that adds some context in terms of how you could start, and add some awareness around the fact that you don't need any prerequisites when you start in terms of ML and AI. So for an introduction, I'm Ramit Sahani. I finished undergrad in NSIT Delhi in computer science and engineering. Although the branch technically did not matter for me, but I'd still say that being in CS does help to a certain extent. So I started from there. When I was just finishing college in my last semester, so I was already much behind compared to what students are doing these days in terms of being very active very early on. So I started fairly late in terms of college, etc., and it took me a while to realize what I want to do, even within a tech job, etc. So I started working on an undergraduate thesis. We had to do it as part of our degree. So in fact, if you think about it, my ML and AI journey started mostly because I needed marks in my college. That's kind of how it started. And a group of us, two other friends and me, we decided to start working on one of the most common problems that everyone does today. I think it's, and this is also like a roadmap that, what I'm discussing is kind of like a roadmap for those interested in getting started with MLAI. So, with the thesis project, the easiest way of starting with MLAI is to look at what existing projects are other people doing. Another good way, because at times MLAI code can be very not the most inviting, I would say, not the easiest. It has a lot of prerequisites. So, an easy way is to look for projects where the code already exists, the resources already exist, and based on all that kind of information, we decided that we'd start with the standard sentiment classification of tweets. I think it's the most standard project that people end up doing. And we decided that we'll start with that. Now, this is where the first roadblock comes, because you're interested in doing machine learning and AI, but you have no background. So how do you start? Do you look for professors, etc.? In NSIT, in my college, there were people doing research, but I would say it wasn't really happening at the international level where you'd present at some of the best conferences, and there was a gap in terms of the resources I had in terms of pursuing research as well as what the college offered. So at that point, it becomes a choice where you can either find some kind of external mentorship, or you can find things like try to do it yourself. A good suggestion for people to start, like what I did, was start with your friends. There's no harm in terms of starting with friends. In fact, that usually ends up working much better if you work with your friends. So we did that. Once we started working, I think there was a lot of issues in terms of getting, I would say, traction in terms of research. You start research, so it's easy to look up existing code. It's easy to look at projects that people have done. But if you want to publish your own paper, you need to have an idea that people have not seen before. It can be simple ideas, or it can be novel insights, but your contributions need to advance some field in some sort of way. So when we think of NLP, everyone has already done Twitter sentiment classification. So you can't just do the same thing and expect to get a publication out of it. But what you can do is you can expect it to, you can make modifications, you can make improvements. And that's a good way of starting. Like, look at the code for, say, Twitter sentiment analysis, for example, and Once you look at that code, you will see that, what are some initial changes you can make. There are lots of things. I won't get into individual changes here, but you'll see that existing methods for Twitter sentiment analysis don't do really well on financial tweets. So you can think of your own algorithm of doing better for financial NLP, for example. So we started like that. We started working on a Twitter sentiment kind of problem. A few months later, we did a lot of experiments, all those things. We decided that let's submit a paper. What's the harm? And this is something I'd recommend to all of you. If you're interested in research, don't wait for your professors, other students, to don't wait for anything to start. You can start completely on your own. Another good thing about research is that often research paper submissions are double blind. Double blind here means no, whenever you submit the paper, no one knows what your identity will be till it's accepted. So there's no bias in terms of which college are you from, what CGPA you had, what branch are you from, and all of these things. It's very open and inclusive to all, just as long as the content that you're producing is of actual quality and advances science in multiple ways. So that's kind of the key idea in terms of doing research. So we did that, spent a few months, decided that, even if we don't have a professor or anything, let's just submit a paper on our own and we'll see how it goes. Funnily enough, the paper got accepted. We got great reviews with it, and I would say that's how my journey in research began. But I wasn't aware, and hopefully this is a problem I'm trying to solve now. I wasn't aware of what kind of career prospects one has, in the research field. Like, do I necessarily need to do masters? Do I necessarily need to do a PhD? Do I necessarily need to do some kind of extra courses, diplomas, whatever? So I decided that it's safer to stick to my software engineering job, which was what I was doing at Tower Research Capital. But I knew that I can take some time out to do research on the side. Another good thing if you want to pursue research is that it can always be done on the side. You can, again, I'm not endorsing working on weekends or longer hours, but what the only time I had available was to work during weekends or work during late nights. So you make time for the additional research that you want to do, and once you are able to make that much amount of time, it's basically a good way of starting to contribute to research. You submit your papers. Now the good thing about research is that, let's say you submit your paper, a lot of people are worried that, is my idea going to be good enough? I think I see a lot of questions on the chat already where people are asking, um, how do we, I think one of the questions is, how can I elaborate on what makes a research paper different from a project report on a pre-existing paper? What amount of derivative work is accepted in a research paper? And this differs. I wouldn't say that you need to have 25% different content, 50% different content. Rather, it's important to know that, even if it's like I'll give you an example. One of the papers I presented recently in Dominican Republic, most recent paper, in that paper, the actual change that we made in mathematical formula was 2 lines. In code, it was 3 lines of code. That's it. So I would say it's an extremely big derivative of existing work, but the impact it had was significant. So when people look at research, I would say, don't look at plagiarizing, or obviously don't make obvious dupes. But if your idea is a small idea, it doesn't need to be a huge idea. If it's a small idea and it does its job, try submitting your paper. The good thing with conferences and journals is that you can submit your paper. Worst case, what's going to happen? It'll get rejected, right? It's kind of like applying to a job. Worst case, you will get rejected, you will feel bad, but you'll get some feedback, you'll improve on it, use your paper reviews, improve your paper, and then submit your paper the next time. So the core idea with research is you don't need any other person to start. There are resources like Kaggle, Google Colab, etc. Use all those resources, use everything that you get, and just feel free to start. I think there's no reason to not start with research. Find friends, find mentors. I think I'm someone who, I think after doing a lot of independent research myself, reached a point where I started mentoring a lot of people. So in fact, today, if you look at the co-authors that I've had, we've had people who belong to tier 3 colleges. I've never looked at branch, none of it. It's always been anyone can start. The only thing is you need to, be willing to put in the time. So continuing in terms of my journey, I did the full-time job. I was doing research on the side. We started working with other undergraduate students, etc., etc. And it has now got me to a point where I feel like I've published some amount of work. I'm not sure how much impact it makes, but I feel like I've understood at least what the process is and how we can at least give it a start. The next step, which I think is a good question that Sravya Reddy has asked about, how do you collaborate with German professors and how was the work presented in Germany. So to answer that, I would say that the biggest way in which it happened was, before I had papers of my own, I would often contact people. You randomly message people on LinkedIn, you email professors, you email companies, and you say that I'm interested in working. What can I do to work with you? And you don't get replies, right? And it's not their fault. Like, why should they give you their time? Ultimately, their time is definitely precious, and what can you bring to the table? There are hundreds of students who are approaching people like them every day. That's where research opens up your doors, because I started alone with my friends, without any professors, without any resources. And once you have a paper of your own, you can kind of show that, this is the value I bring to the table. So if you have your own papers, if you have all of that, that is when you should reach out to professors. If you have nothing to differentiate you in terms of other candidates, think of it like this. Like, imagine that you're a professor and you get hundreds of emails every day from students. At that point, why will they pick you out of any other students? You need to have something to differentiate yourself. A good way is to show that you can do independent research, which is through a research paper, research projects. If you're not able to do that, also try something like looking at their existing research papers. I'll give you a tip. If you, for example, if you now want to work with me, the best way of working with me, I would say, is look up any paper of mine. They're all online. Look up any paper of mine, send me an email, and tell me in 1 or 2 lines why you think my paper is, how you can improve it. What was something I did wrong in it? Is there something incorrect you see in it? Basically, you need to show that this is not some generic cold email you're sending. You need to show how you'll add value if you start working with me. And that's how it worked with Germany. It was rather random, because it started with a message on Twitter. I published some work of mine. This professor in Germany saw the work that I was doing. She cited her paper in mine. Cited here means she referenced my paper in hers. We started talking, and a few months later, maybe not few months, maybe like 7, 8 months later, she asked me if we started working together. We started getting papers together, etc. And at some point she asked me that, do you think you would want to come to Germany for a research visit? And that was, I think, one of the most shocking things that happened to me in 2021. I thought, even with COVID, how is that even possible? But I thought the even weirder thing is that I don't even, she's not my professor from college. It's a random chat that started on Twitter. But it goes to show the power of your own research. It goes to show others that this is how much you can do, and therefore it's important. Taking a few questions along these lines very, very quickly, based on papers. I'll first take a question from Himanchan Chandra, which says, how do you see Indian conferences when compared with international conferences in the field of AI? So this is relevant, and the reason why I chose to answer this instead of the others first is, when I started thinking that, should I so when you start, you think that I just want a research paper. This was my first thing. I, in fact, remember telling this friend of mine, funnily she works in LinkedIn now, but I remember telling her at one point that, look, I don't care what paper it is, whatever it is, I just want a research paper. That's it. Wherever it comes from, let's just submit it anywhere. And we submitted to an Indian conference. And I'm not saying all Indian conferences are bad or anything. And I would even say that this demarcation of Indian versus international conference doesn't mean too much either. But I would say that was a lower quality conference, and you understand lower quality because you can see on Google Scholar, etc., what the top rated conferences are, their core rankings, Google Scholar rankings, etc. So you can see what the top conferences are. And my suggestion is to only submit to those, not because we are chasing the best things, but simply because those are the ones that are credible. You don't want to do a lot of hard work and end up putting a bunch of your hard work and dedication into a conference where your work is not valued. So I'd suggest this, that in terms of Indian conferences, there are a few Indian conferences that are good. I might not know all of them, but Icon, CODS, COMAD, these are some nice conferences that I know of. My suggestion would be, don't think of them as Indian versus international conferences. Simply see where the people that you are kind of looking up to, where they publish. So I would suggest that. Like, for me, it's always been only top A star conferences, and not because I'm trying to get top papers, but simply because I feel those are the conferences where my work will have actual impact. A follow-up to that is Anupam Patil's question, that what H index should we try to target as undergraduates? So I'll say this, that, and I think it's a great question, because there are two parts to it. The first part is what kind of H index conferences should we try. The second part is as undergraduates. I used to think that those two things were separate, but I would tell you this, that it doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate or PhD or a full-time employee or whatever. I would say that you should only strive to publish in one of the best venues where your work will have actual impact. So stick to conferences where only the best are there. It's difficult to quantify by H index. I feel citations are a good metric, but not the best. So it's difficult to say because every field would have different citations. But I would say this, that if you look at NLP, for example, most of the top conferences have an H index of above 80. So this would be EACL, ACL, EMNLP, NACL, COLIC. Stick with these conferences. Stick with the conferences where the people who you look up to publish the most. Next conference is from, next, you can see how obsessed I am if I'm saying next conference. Question from Ritvik Behel is, what is the importance of citation in research papers, and do more citations mean better the paper? I think it's a philosophical question, or a question that's not very easy to answer. But I would say that citations do have some kind of correlation with how good the paper is, because likely it would get more citations if it has more impact. Like if you look at papers like the ones that introduce BERT, GPT-3, attention, CNNs, etc. Of course, they have a lot of citations because they made a lot of impact. However, I would also say this, that just because a paper doesn't have citations doesn't mean it doesn't have impact. I would go as far as saying some of my papers that have the most citations today, I feel are weaker papers than the papers that I have with fewer citations. So I think it depends on the overall quality, where it's published, what the core real life impact of it is, how much does it advance science over citations. But yes, unfortunately, those are very subjective metrics. So citations end up becoming a good metric to think of. In fact, when you think, when you try to look at someone's quality of work, one thing we do look at is citations. A better way to look at citations is also through things like H index, etc. Lots of nice metrics based on citations. So I'd suggest looking at those. Okay, lots of questions. So I'm still behind on some, but still, I'm taking Abhishek's question next, which says, what's the main difference between a conference and a journal? So it depends, I think, field to field. I would say for computer science, we're at a point where conferences are definitely more popular than journals. But still, to break it down, journals are when you basically submit a paper, and the end goal is that it will get published in a journal, but you'll not go to a conference, meet other researchers, and present it to them. So there's a little networking aspect that's lost around with a journal. But a benefit of a journal is that you can submit, you'll get reviews, and you can keep revising and improving your paper again and again. Whereas in a conference, there's always a certain deadline. You submit the paper by that deadline. After some, usually months, if it's a good conference, usually months, because it takes a while to review. After a few months, you get a notification. Either the paper is accepted or it's rejected. If in either case, if it's accepted, you're invited to come and present the paper. And in those cases, you can network more, you can talk more, and you can discuss work more easily. So in CS, ML, AI, conferences seem to be doing better because there's so much progress happening so rapidly that it makes sense to go and meet people, discuss these ideas. But if you look at things like physics, chemistry, in these kind of domains, journals are more popular at the moment. Okay. Next question from Harshit Garg. Did you ever feel like I should prefer doing software development or CP during software engineering? So, in fact, my entire background has been that. I did a software development job till the last 6 months. So my entire time, not entire time, but my last 2 years in college were focused on simply preparing for software development jobs. I tried competitive programming. It was not my cup of tea. I would say I'm not smart enough to do that. So I tried but failed miserably. And at one point I gave up. I thought I can't do competitive programming. I focused more on some other fundamentals like database, operating systems, all of these things, which to date help me. These help me in my machine learning job and research as well. And I decided that I'll focus on these. It helped me get my first software engineering job. And at some point, I realized that I'm enjoying doing whatever I do in software engineering, but I can take out some time parallelly, whether it's weekends, late nights, doing research. And that's kind of how it started. Okay, next question is C68 Shivam Mishra, who says, how do you prepare for masters as well as placements? So I think you need to prioritize something. Like that's kind of how life works, right? You can't say I want to do both simultaneously. Like when I started, I knew my priority was my software job at Tower Research. So I knew that if papers get rejected or if there's a work deadline that I have to meet, I will focus on that first. I will not let the papers come in front of that. So my suggestion to you would be this, that this is just from a personal perspective, that You can apply for a master's later as well, but the placements will come only once. So unless you're absolutely sure I want to, do a master, settle abroad or whatever, I would suggest focus initially on your placements. And in fact, that will also help you, because when you do data science, ML kind of jobs, or even if you do a master's in computer science or AI, you need to have those fundamentals like basic data structures, algorithms, um, operating systems, database management, all of those kind of things. And in correlation with that is Shalmali Rathor's question asking about, do you need knowledge of data structures and algorithms for data science? So I would say yes and no. You need some basic understanding for sure. Basic understanding means you should know trees, graphs, arrays, all of that. But you don't need it to the extent where sometimes people would go for comparative programming. I feel comparative programming is more of it's more of an engaging activity that drastically helps a lot, but it's not mandatory. You don't need to go that extra mile in terms of studying. So you don't need to know what a segment tree is, for example, but you should know what is a regular tree. Then the next question is from Pankaj Kulkarni. How do you, what is the process of getting papers published or patents? So I'm not an expert with patents. I don't have any. So I'll just talk about research papers. So the process is basically this, and it's easier once you've got a hang of it. But for me, the process is you define some kind of high level problems that you want to solve. One of the high level problems that I've worked on recently was, how can we use NLP data, like text on Twitter, social media, Reddit, etc. How can we use that to build better trading algorithms for finance? Now that's an open problem, and you start looking at what people have done already. You need to find a challenge. Don't start research by thinking that I need to publish something, so where do I look at, how do I start publishing? Rather, there's so many open problems that you'll come across. Try to see how you can do those better. Try to see how you can experiment with it, play around with it. See if you can get other people interested. Are there similar people at your work? Do you have friends who do this? Are there random people on LinkedIn who you could probably reach out to and see if they would be interested in working on these kind of problems with you? So do that. Once you do that, you start working, you do experiments, you'll keep failing. At some point when you realize that you have reached and research has progressed to a point where even if you have negative results but they introduce interesting findings, people would be interested in learning about that. So after you feel like you've got some useful findings, you start writing your paper, you try to edit it, draft it, get it reviewed from different people. After all that is done, you usually submit it to a conference deadline. Now go to Google Scholar or Core conference rankings and you'll see what the top conferences are. Look at what their deadlines are, see which ones align the best. If you're doing NLP related work, look at some NLP conferences, look at the deadline, by then polish your paper, submit the paper, and at that point, if the paper gets accepted, great. If it doesn't get accepted, you can keep doing iterations. Okay. Next question, how do you go about identifying open problems in areas of your interests? So this is basically, if you need to keep reading research papers, you need to be in contact with people who read research on a daily basis. You need to be in that kind of environment. It's kind of like saying, how do I decide which mutual funds to invest in? Or it's kind of like saying, how do I decide which restaurant I should eat in today, or which new restaurant I should try? You'll only know if you're aware of what new restaurants have been opening, right? So my suggestion for that in practical sense is, there are a few Twitter accounts. In fact, I do it myself. So if you're interested, feel free to, like, social media is, I think, a great way of disseminating that information. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of these. Like, I talk about all of these things there. Come follow me, you'd see. But there are even better accounts like on Twitter where, some very relevant papers to you keep getting recommended. In fact, Google Scholar, Semantic Scholar, these are websites that keep looking at what kind of work you're interested in and they recommend papers. Basically, I would suggest subscribe to some free Twitter accounts, LinkedIn accounts, follow people who talk about research, see what they talk about, and that way you'll see what are, like, if, for example, if you're interested in finance, you'll see that I will talk about finance related papers, financial problems. And when that happens, you will see that I'll also talk about my own paper. And when you start reading papers, the biggest way of doing that is first finding relevant papers. After you find relevant papers, you need to start reading those relevant papers. And when you start reading the papers, you'll start identifying that, oh, maybe this could have been done slightly differently. Why didn't they do this? Or maybe I should try it like this. Another good way is if you start looking at future work that people write in their papers. That's a very good way of finding problem statements around those areas. Manisha Reddy has asked, how do you start data science research if I'm from a BCom background? So I would say that because I personally don't have that kind of background, it's very difficult for me to say. But I feel you already have some math background that would help you. But my suggestion would be that in such a case, you need to start doing some sort of courses. These could be free online courses, they could be paid courses like what Scalar has, for example. It depends on how much you feel you can do on your own versus what kind of content is available. But I would suggest taking up some kind of course rather than winging it completely on your own. Next question is, one concern is from Ginny Garg around the cost of publication in conferences. Very valid point. So when I started, it was a very big problem for us. Like the registration fees was 44,000 Indian rupees. I still remember, and it was 3 students, and we didn't know how do we pay for this. So we decided that from our internship stipends, we'll just split the money and we'll pay it. So we did that, but it's not a sustainable thing. I would not recommend it to anyone. I would say this, that most of the top conferences, especially if you're students, they will fund your paper. There are even scholarships that will allow you to go for these conferences. I, in fact, back just right before COVID, lucky me, but right before COVID, I attended this conference in China and I got a full travel grant to go there. So the top conferences will help you in terms of getting sponsored. So you should try that. If you're in college, you can try to get your college to also fund it. There are also a lot of Indian government programs that even grants from Microsoft, Google, etc., where if you've published in a really nice conference, they will look into funding it. So lots of funding opportunities. You can even volunteer at conferences to get free registration. Try that. Like the better the conference, the more easily you will get funding for it. Next question from Mad Max. How long will it take me to write my first research paper? Okay, that's a great question. I think we started sometime around November 2017, and the paper was finally published in July 2018. So it took about eight-ish months, I would say. And we got lucky because the paper got accepted in the first go. But I have had cases where where papers have been in the pipeline for more than a year. So time is something that may or may not be at your side with research. There are lots of different angles that come into play. So I would say, don't think of research as a short time investment. That I'm going to put in 2 months and I'll get some research output. You might, but it's not a good mindset to start with. Do we need a considerable amount of experience with ML development to actually get started with our own research? From Jayesh Tripathi. I would say if you have it, it's great. But I would say if you don't, you can still start. Like I started with practically no experience. A good thing there is, though, you should try to find people who have done it before. Like I didn't have any such person, so it was a very, very hard journey for me. But it's easier if you know people who kind of know what they're doing. But even if you don't, you can still manage. Like I would say, you don't have to do end-to-end parts. If you work in groups, you can do small parts. You can look at existing code, make some minor modifications there, and that would be a good place to start. Next question, you've essentially transitioned from dev to AI. How easy was it for you? So I think it's difficult to say that I transitioned from dev to AI. I know that's what my LinkedIn profile, or on paper, that's what it looks like. But I would say that I was always doing AI research. In fact, I was doing AI research before I was an industry dev. So I would say those things have always been going parallel for me. And at one point, I just chose that, this is a job that might be more aligned for me. So for me, it was very natural and very straightforward. There was no extra effort, preparation, or any of those things that I needed to do. But for someone who wants to do it from a dev to AI, I would say it's not an easy journey, especially if you're doing it. If you're already doing a full-time job and you don't know anything yet, starting is difficult. That's the kind of where these courses, etc., come in, or that's where you need to be parts of groups where people who know what they're doing can kind of tell you what should be the next steps. Okay, next question. Being a machine learning engineer, if I come up with something of my own, how do I verify if my approach is worth writing a research paper? I think that's an absolutely great question. Two ways to think about it. One is you can try reading more. Like the more papers you'll read, you'll see. I'll give you an example. So a while ago, I got this great idea that why don't we try something like it's difficult to explain here, but I thought, why don't we try something like using social network graphs and graph neural networks for hate speech detection. So I decided that, okay, before I put in more effort here, let me go and Google and see if other people have done it. And I saw hundreds of papers pop up. So a good way is search for what you think you've done. Try to see if people would easily do it. Like, have people already done it? How easily available is it? If you find it very easily available, I would say perhaps it's not going to be worth writing a paper, because you've not invented something new, there's no new findings. A more different route could be just go ahead, submit it. If it looks similar to existing stuff, the reviewers who are experts will let you know. And maybe you wasted some time, but you tried the research paper procedure. And perhaps if it was actually something new, then maybe the paper does get accepted. So the good part about conferences is you get feedback. So don't be scared in submitting your work. Go ahead, submit it. Competitive programming versus research work, which brings more attention and is preferred by recruiters or companies. So not a good question, but not a straightforward answer. It depends. It depends on what company you're targeting. Like if you're targeting, for example, I'll give you example of the companies I've worked in. If you work in Tower Research Capital, the research work won't help you too much. Like they were interested in hearing what kind of research I do, but it's not related to the company, right? So what benefit will I bring them? Versus if you think of something like Google research, now their day-to-day work is research, so they'll be more interested. So I'd say having a balance of both is definitely great. I think if you're looking at more SD dev oriented roles, you should think competitive programming or DSA can help you more. But having some extra flavor of research is not bad, and vice versa. If you're doing research scientist roles, if you have a competitive programming background, not bad. But focus on the job. Like, don't try to do everything that I want to do, be the best in competitive programming. I want to do the best research. Can't do it. Like, even, I mean, I tried at one point, but you can't. At least I didn't succeed in doing it. Question from Amir is, what is the difference between industry and academic research? I think industry research to an extent focuses on problems that would eventually get shipped into some kind of product at some point of time, like how do you improve Google search, for example. Academic research at times can be very, very theoretical. Like there might be a huge gap between that and it going into the real world. So I'd say those are pretty much the only differences. But academic research obviously means you have much more freedom in terms of what you can do. Whereas in industry research, you have to be aligned with the career goals and all of those things. Okay, still lots of questions, so I need a break for a second. Okay, follow up from Chaser. Was it a hard decision or did it come naturally to switch? So from dev to AI. So I'd say, yeah, it was somewhat natural. I would say that I've been someone who never really had a clear plan in terms of what I should be doing. So it's difficult to say. I wasn't sure that should I do it, but I now that I've done it, I feel like perhaps it was the right choice. In terms of how would I rate industrial research opportunities in India, I think I rate them fairly well. I think it's comparative to abroad. Now, the number of companies abroad are much higher, so one would think that opportunities are better there. But I think in terms of pay, in terms of work, in terms of opportunities, the ones happening in India are phenomenal. Go for it. In fact, even in terms of pay, I was seeing lots of questions asking about pay in terms of this. So I don't know a lot of numbers, but from at least from what I know in general, usually MLAI roles, even in India, because it's a demand supply thing, right? Because there are fewer people who specialize. I think there's at times there's more money in that area. But again, that's just my perspective. Next question along the same lines, is there good money in academic research when compared to industry AI ML jobs? So I don't know because I'm not in academic research myself, so it's difficult to say. But from what I understand in India, I think that's a place where we need to grow. I think academic research in India, there definitely can be more funding, more initiatives where we can do better. So I would say in terms of India, perhaps industry AI ML is ahead when it comes to money. But in a global scheme of things, I think they're kind of equivalent. You need to choose what interests you more. If you do well at it, you will make money anywhere. Okay, next question from Kunal Garg. Which is better, MS in CS specialization or MS PhD in AI ML DL? Again, depends on how generic or how specialized you would want to be. I would say if you're doing a PhD, definitely go for like a very niche topic in AI ML DL. But if you're the kind who's interested in something like a machine learning engineering, or you want to do like distributed systems with ML, you're not super interested in only high theoretical stuff or all of that, but you also want to build some engineering background, I would say, excuse me, I would say go ahead with MSCS with a specialization in MLDL. So that's more ML engineer, software engineering and machine learning, etc. But not so much with, if you want to do more hardcore MLAI research, so think of it like this. If your end goal is software engineer or ML engineer, research engineer at Google, do MS and CS. If your end goal is research scientist, do the PhD. Second question, more on algorithm oriented courses in AI machine learning and AI which are affordable in nature. So I don't know what exactly algorithm oriented courses in AI/ML mean. I think you mean like a subfield like optimization, etc. I feel that there's not a lot of great courses, at least that I know of. I would suggest go look at the books. That's what my suggestion would be. Next question is there any scope of research with fields like quantitative finance and fintech? Within India, not so much. Outside India, tons and tons and tons of it. So I was actually contemplating at some point if my research would make a lot of sense in terms of how things are abroad. And now what I do at Georgia Tech, I work in the fintech and ML lab in Georgia Tech now. So I'd say abroad there is a huge amount of scope, and it's a big booming field because fintech is booming, AI ML is booming, research is booming. So the combination is something that can definitely add a lot of value to your profile. Thinking of data science masters next year, do you suggest US or German universities? I would say it again depends on, there's so many different characteristics that's difficult to answer. What I can do is I can give you a comparison and you can choose. But yeah, my suggestion would be if Germany is definitely much more cost friendly because I think you pay a much, or maybe you don't even pay a tuition fee. In terms of livability, etc., it's your personal preference if you prefer US or you prefer Germany. But I think Germany is also investing a lot of money. So cost is definitely a big factor. You also need to see what kind of industry jobs are you looking at. Another angle is if you're thinking of coming back to India or not. Even if you're thinking of living in Germany versus US, like US, I think visa immigration is more complicated than Germany, for example. So personal preferences, I think quality of work is great in both places. Please advise on how to get research positions at US European universities. I think I've gone over this a couple of times, but you definitely need to focus on what I mentioned earlier, that you need to have some research on done on your own. You can't just go to and tell people that, look, I want to work with you because I'm XYZ. You need to have something that shows that your interest, your work. You need to have research papers, projects. You need to show how you will add value to other people. That's it. Next question, or rather remark from Sukriti Mehta, is my only knowledge of academy research is Big Bang Theory. Do PhD folks get less money when compared to industry? I guess. Again, I'm not a PhD student, so I don't know. But my understanding is because ultimately, as a PhD, you're a student, right? It's not a full-time job. Like you will not end up doing it for all your life, hopefully. So but if you're talking about do PhD folks after graduating from PhD and if they go to the industry, do they earn lesser money? Definitely not. They definitely earn more money simply because you're doing a much more niche field. The amount you invested, the amount of time you invested in your PhD allowed you to get a huge load of skills that most people do not have. So that's the whole thing around AI/ML, that it's a much more niche field. So there's more demand and therefore there can be more money, but you need to be more specialized in that area. Next question. How difficult is it to get into industrial research without a master's or PhD? So tricky question. I would want to say that it's easy. It's not as difficult, but I would say that you need to have done a lot of hard work beforehand to do that. Like just tying to my previous question, it's a specialized field which not a lot of colleges teach. So you need to take up the extra initiative to be able to do that. And that's why a master's or a PhD come into play, right? Because those are the extra initiatives that can help you in terms of doing better, in terms of expanding, in terms of getting into some of these industry level MLAI roles. Okay, next. A few companies in India which I could look for MLAI related intern jobs in India. I think there are lots. So not to endorse or anything. So the companies I'm saying just come out of my own mind. They don't have any correlation or anything like that. But first example I can give is ShareChat because I work there, so I know, and we are hiring interns. So if you're interested, feel free to apply. But then there's obviously Amazon, there's Google, there is Google. Microsoft has applied in data scientist kind of roles. Adobe Research, Adobe Noida has a great lab called MDSR Lab where I've seen like absolutely phenomenal work. You should look into that. Swiggy, there are a lot of startups that are also doing MLAI kind of work. So the work is definitely there. Just make sure you are interested in the specialized kind of area, and you can make some contributions, and or you can show that this field is something that you can contribute to, and that will hopefully help. And there are a couple of questions that I think are beyond my scope, so I'll just mention them. But I don't think I can correctly answer these, so I would rather just say I can't answer them because I'm not qualified enough rather than answer these. But questions around edge AI, quantum ML, microbiology, definitely out of my realm. So I'm sorry, but I'd rather not give you bad advice. Question from Piyush is, could you please explain the process? Also, one quick thing: we are on for the next 10 more minutes. So I'll try to take as many as I can, but this is your chance. Put in your questions towards the end. Later, if you have more questions, reach out to me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever. It's an easy name. It's an uncommon name. You will find me fairly easily. So, question from Piyush, could you please explain the process for reputed workshops and conferences, and if possible, the beginner steps? So, I'm not going to talk about the part of till where you get the paper. I think I've spoken about it a lot. So, we are going with the assumption that you have a paper ready. We've also discussed how you choose good conferences and workshops. Basically, you see whose work impresses you, what kind of work you're interested in doing, and you see where they publish, and you try to follow that. And you see if the conference workshop relates to what you do. Then you submit the paper. In some cases, there's a rebuttal. A rebuttal means when you submit a paper, your reviews are released. The reviewers ask you some questions. You can answer that. Some cases, there's no rebuttal. Based on the reviews, the conference either accepts or declines, or conference workshop either accepts or rejects the paper. If the paper is accepted, you take in the reviewer feedback, make what they call a camera ready paper, submit to that finally, and then you go ahead, present your paper, and at some point the paper will get published. If your paper gets rejected, you pretty much, it's up to you on how many. There's no guarantee, right? It doesn't say that if the paper is rejected, we'll accept it the next time. You have to improve it, keep improving till it gets accepted at some point, or at some point you realize that we the initial premise of our work was wrong. So it's not like every paper that has got rejected should get published. There might be reasons that it doesn't need to be published, where you could just leave it as a technical report. I would also suggest against, if your paper is getting rejected at some of the top conferences, often people think that, okay, let me submit it to a lower conference, a more mediocre thing, just because something is better than nothing. Personally, I would advise against that. I don't think there's value in research that has no contributions. I think even towards your profile, it doesn't help. So start with meaningful work, and hopefully you'll end up getting it published. Question from Saurav Yadav on how can you start, and probably the next question from Ahmad also, both along these lines. I think, like I said, I don't think research has any barriers. You can start at any point of time. The only goal is start reading papers, start looking at existing work that people do, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, you need to be in a place where you can start. I don't think anything is holding you back, college, branch, course, whatever. Next, Jayesh Tripathi, did you take a formal maths course in order to understand research papers better as a beginner? No, I did not. I feel in my college there was a lot that was covered in terms of math, etc. A lot. Like, I've done standard whatever people do in engineering, but most of the times that is sufficient. I think as computer engineering, I'd also did lots of random processes, probability theory, all of that. So I feel that was enough for me to start understanding, and the rest you can just learn online. I don't think you need to take a formal course explicitly, but if your college did not, or like whatever education you had before did not cover those aspects, then perhaps you should think of a formal course. Similar question from Rupal Sinha around, do you have any research paper that did not require any math applications? Unfortunately, no. I would say all of my work has been math oriented. However, there are other domains that are closely related to AI ML. Like HCI is a good domain where I've seen a lot of people where you don't have math expertise, but you can still do great impact. Next question from Ahmed again. I'm a working professional. I'm more interested in healthcare, also ML. Any specific company in the healthcare domain? I think there are lots. I don't know any personally well enough to endorse or not endorse. So I won't name anything. But I do a lot of work in healthcare and ML, and I have no background there. So I would suggest, look at whatever medical problems you're interested in, start reading papers, and just give it a go. There's no harm in trying. Next question, Sahib Preet saying, how should I choose a topic for research in the field of NLP? It's a very vague question. I mean, I'd say that, I can recommend 100 statements to you here, but you need to understand what interests you, right? Like, there has to be some problem that interests you. It's kind of like saying, how do I choose? It's kind of like asking me, how do I choose which dish should I order at McDonald's? Like, there must be something you like, so do that. Next question is, could you point out some quality resources, microeconomics, data science research related papers? But I would say no. I think Google Scholar is a great place to look at it. Another place is Semantic Scholar. I would say look at Semantic Scholar, type microeconomics, MLAI, data science research, you'll find them. On Google Scholar also you'll find enough so you'll find enough good journals or top rated conferences based on H index, and you can see what kind of papers there are there. Okay, next is from Udit Agarwal and from NSIT, generally published in IEEE transactions. Okay, it's a good advisor. How does this journal compare? Okay, I think the journals are great. It's again it's up to, I would say this, that it's again a personal preference. If you prefer the journal style versus the conference style, like personally, people I work with prefer the conference style. I think a benefit is you get to do a lot more networking with conferences, which works well with my kind of work. But I also see the benefit of journal. So I think it's a trade-off. There's no clear-cut comparison in terms of what is better. It depends on what your goals are, kind of. So in my case, I would much rather, try AAA or ICML than the journals. But that being said, the journals are also great. Next question from Sahib Preet. I applied for data science role, share chat. I was ruled out in the first round. DSA is a general criteria. So first, I don't build the criteria for these, so I can't vouch for any of this. But I do agree with the process that we do need some kind of basic coding and problem solving expertise, right? Like it's not feasible for ML or data scientist type of roles to tell you to code an entire neural network in an hour. So the closest thing to know that, like, how do we know that you can code well? How do we know that your problem solving skills are there? So that's kind of where data structures and algorithms comes into play. But a focus of mine and most of the people that I work with in ShareChat has been that we don't want our DSA rounds to be overly complicated. We don't want them to be comparative programming, like where you need to know a lot of expertise, but you need to know how to code and some basic problem solving, right? Next question, Shilpi saying, how can I research at Midas Labs? Whom to reach out in interview process? I think interview process changes a lot, so I can't vouch for that. But usually there are some interviews, discussions. At times there's a coding task. Look at who you're. I mean, if you're interested in doing research at Midas Labs, you also must be interested in some topic. Whatever the topic is, see who does that work. Send them an email. Otherwise, you can always reach out to Professor Rajiv Ratan Shah, and if he finds you suitable, he'll definitely start an interview process. I think Midas is one of the most inclusive labs that I've seen in terms of work. So, I would say go for it, no harm. Same question from Savvy again. Can we, people from non-core background, pursue as a research? I've gone over that enough times, so won't get into this again and again. What is the research paper I'm most proud of? I think there are lots, and there are many for different reasons. But I would say this, and I probably like a cheesy answer, but I would say I'm the most proud of the first paper I put in, because I think that was the most difficult. Like I'm quite sure my first paper barely makes any contributions compared to anything else, but that was the biggest and most difficult thing for me to start. So that's how I think of it. Experience at Triple IT Delhi was absolutely phenomenal. I have not been to Triple IT Delhi enough. I think I've gone there like 2-3 times in my life. But the people, the group, the research atmosphere and culture is absolutely great. In fact, at times I think that also Triple IT is very close to my house compared to NSIT. So a lot of times I look back and think that I wish I did go to Triple IT instead of NSIT. But so hopefully that gives you enough idea in terms of why I wanted to do what I think of Triple IT. Is ZS a good company for data science, and how can we crack interview for text analytics? I think these are too specific for me to answer, so I'll pass. A lot of questions that are there above, so I'll use the last 2 minutes to take the questions I missed initially. But if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us. Reach out to Scalar, reach out to me on any of the social media platforms. Scalar, me, we're on all of them. So we'll reach out to you there and take up any more questions that you have. We also plan on doing more sessions like this. So, and we'll give you a bigger time heads up from next time. So we'll take those questions. But last questions quickly. How do we start with research? I think we already done that. Mechanical engineering, same stuff. Okay, statistics. This is from Saurav Chakravarti. Statistics should be learned as a base of ML, right? Would you kindly tell us about some resources? So I think yes, definitely. Resources wise, again, I don't want to endorse anything, but I think there are lots of courses, lots of books online. Personally, I prefer just reading books, online PDFs and books. So start reading basic stuff, like when you look at linear regression. the linear regression is also a stats problem. A lot of people don't think of it from the stats perspective, but if you start googling, you'll find a lot more around it. Final question that I'll take, hopefully a small one. Growth opportunities. Someone's asking about a paid course at IISc. I don't want to answer any of this. Okay, last question from Shivam Mishra, BTech student. I want to have some projects in MLAI, plus be open for software engineering. So, how do you prepare for both? Okay, I think we kind of answered this already, but I'll again say this, that just based on what you're mentioning, it seems more like you're interested in a software engineering role first. So, keep research as a back end kind of thing. Try to do software engineering like projects in the MLAI space, but not research oriented, and hopefully that would be good. So that being said, I think there's still a lot of questions that I wasn't able to take, but I'm really glad for all the participation. Next time we'll have more heads up, and thank you for your time. Thank you for joining, and yeah, reach out to us on all social media platforms. We'll be happy to chat. Okay, thanks for your time, everyone. Nice, have a nice day. Bye bye.